Vadis, Chapter 9. Ligia was grieved to lose Pomponia Gracina, whom she loved with her whole soul, and she grieved for the household of Aulus. Still her despair passed away. She felt a certain delight even in the thought that she was sacrificing plenty and comfort for her truth, and was entering into an unknown and wandering existence. Perhaps there was in this a little also childish curiosity as to what the life will be of somewhere in remote regions among wild beasts and barbarians. But there was still more a deep and trusting faith that by acting thus she was doing as a divine master had commanded, and had henceforth he himself will watch over her, as over the obedient and faithful child. And such a case, what harm could meet her? If sufferings come, she will endure him in his name. If sudden death come, he will take her. And sometime when Poponia dies, they will be together for eternity. More than once, when she was in the house of Aulus, she tortured her childish head, because she, a Christian, will do nothing for that crucified, of whom Ursus spoke with such tenderness. But now the moment had come, Ligia felt almost happy, and began to speak of her happiness to Acte, who could not understand her, however. To leave everything, to leave the house, wealth, the city, gardens, temples, porticos, everything that is beautiful, leave a sunny land and people near to one. And for what purpose? To hide from love of a young and stately knight. In Acta's head these things could not find place. At times she felt that Ligia's actions was right, but there must be some immense mysterious happiness in it. But she could not give a clear account to herself of the matter, especially since an adventure was before Ligia which might have an evil ending, an adventure in which she might lose her life simply. Acte was timid by nature, and she thought with dread of what the coming evening might bring, but she was loath to mention her fears to Ligia. Meanwhile, as the day was clear and the sun looked into the atrium, she began to persuade her to take the rest needed after a night without sleep. Ligia did not refuse, and both went to the cubiculum, which was spacious and furnished with luxury because of Acta's former relations with Caesar. They were laid down side by side, but in spite of her weariness, Acta could not sleep. For a long time she had been sad and unhappy, but now she was seized with a certain uneasiness which she had never felt before. So far life had seemed to her simply grievous, and deprived of a morrow. Now all one seemed to her dishonorable. Increasing chaos rose in her head. Again the other light began to open and close, but in the moment when it opened, that light so dazzled her that she could see nothing distinctly. She divined merely that in that light there was happiness of some kind, happiness beyond measure, in presence of which every other was nothing, to such a degree that in Caesar, for example, were to set apis Poppaea and love her, Acte again it will be vanity. Suddenly the thought came to her that Caesar, whom she loved, whom she held involuntarily a kind of demigod, was as pitiful as any slave, and that palace, with columns of Numidian marble, no better than a heap of stones. Alas, however, those feelings which she had no power to define began to torment her. She wanted to sleep, but being tortured by the alarm she could not. Thinking that Ligia, threatened by so many perils and uncertainties, was not sleeping either, she turned to her to speak of her flight in the evening, but Ligia was sleeping calmly. Into the dark cubiculum, while past the curtain, which was now not closely drawn, came a few bright rays, in which golden dust motes were playing. But the light of those rays, Acte saw her delicate face resting on her bare arm, her closed eyes, and her mouth slightly open. She was breathing regularly, but as people breathe while asleep. She sleeps. She is able to sleep, thought Acte. She is a child yet. Still, after a while, it came to her mind that the child chose to flee rather than remain the beloved of Vinicius. She preferred one to shame, wander into a lordly house, to robes, jewels, and feasts, to the sound of lutes and citaras. Why? And she gazed at Ligia as to find an answer in her sleeping face. She looked at her clear forehead, at the calm arc of her brows, at her dark tresses, at her parted lips, at her virgin bosom moved by calm breathing. Then she thought again, how different from me. Ligia seemed to her a miracle, a sort of divine vision, something beloved of the gods, 100 times more beautiful than all flowers in Caesar's garden, than all the statues in his palace. But in the Greek woman's heart there was no envy. On the contrary, a thought of the dangers which threatened the girl. Great pity seized her. A certain motherly feeling rose in the woman. Ligia seemed to her not only as a beautiful vision, but also very dear, and putting her lips to her dark hair, she kissed it. But Ligia slept on calmly as if at home under the care of Pomponia Graecina, and she slept rather long. Midday had passed when she opened her blue eyes and looked around the cubiculum in astonishment. Evidently she wondered as she was not in the house of Aulus. "That is thou, Acte," said she at last, seeing in the darkness the face of the Greek. "Ay, Ligia, it is evening?" "No, child, but midday has passed." "And has Ursus returned?" "Ursus did not say that he will return. He said he will watch in the evening with Christians for the litter." "True." Then they left the cubiculum and went to the bath, where Acte bathed Ligia, and she took her to breakfast, and afterward to the gardens of the palace, in which no dangerous meeting might be feared, since Caesar and his principal courtiers were sleeping yet. For the first time in her life Livia saw those magnificent gardens, full of pines, cypresses, oaks, olives, and myrtles, among which appeared white here and there a whole population of statues. The mirror of ponds gleamed quietly, groves of roses were blooming, water with spray of mountains, entrances, charming grottos were encircled with a growth of ivy or woodbine, silver-clothed swans were sailing on the water, and amid statues and trees wandered tame gazelles from the deserts of Africa, and rich-colored birds from all the countries on earth. The gardens were empty, but here and there slaves were working, spade in hand, singing in an undertone. Others, to whom was granted a moment of rest, were sitting by ponds or in the shade of groves, in trebly light produced by the sun rays breaking between the leaves. Others were watering roses or the pale lily-colored blossoms of the saffron. Acte and Ligia walked rather long, looking at all the wonders of the gardens, and though Ligia's mind was not at rest, she was too much a child yet to resist pleasure, curiosity, and wonder. It occurred to her even that if Caesar were good, he might be very happy in such a palace, in such gardens. But at last, tired somewhat, the two women sat down on a bench hidden almost entirely by dense cypresses, and began to talk of that which weighed on their hearts most, that is, of Ligia's escape in the evening. Acte was far less at rest than Ligia touching its success, and it seemed to her even a mad project which could not succeed. She felt a growing pity for Ligia. It seemed to her that it would be 100 times safer to try to act on Vinicius. After a while she inquired of Ligia how long she had known him, and whether she did not think that he would let himself be persuaded to return her to Pomponia. But Ligia shook her dark head in sadness. No, in Aulus' house Vinicius had been different. He had been very kind, but since yesterday's feast she feared him, and would rather flee to the legions. "But in Aulus' house," inquired Acte, "he was dear to thee, was he not?" "He was," answered Ligia, inclining her head. "And thou wert not a slave as I was," said Acte after a moment's thought. "Vinicius might marry thee. Thou art as hostage, and a daughter of the Legion king. Aulus and Pomponia love thee as their own child. I am sure they are ready to adopt thee. Vinicius might marry thee, Lygia. But Lygia answered calmly and with still greater silence, I would rather fly to the legions. Lygia does, though, wish me to go directly to Vinicius, rouse him, and he is sleeping, and tell him what I have told thee. Yes, my precious one, I will go to him and say, Vinicius, this is a king's daughter, and a dear child of the famous Aulus. If thou love her, return her to Aulus and Pomponia, and take her as wife from their house. But the maiden answered with a voice so low that Acte could barely hear it, I would rather flee to the legions. And two tears were hanging on her dropping lids. For the conversation was stopped by the rustle of approaching steps, and before Acte had time to see who was coming, Poppaea Sabina appeared in front of the bench with a small retinue of slave women. Retinue of slave women. Two of them held over her head bunches of ostrich feathers fixed to golden wires. With this they fanned her lightly, and at the same time protected her from the autumn sun, which was hot yet. Before her a woman from Egypt, black as ebony, and with bosom swollen as if from milk, bore her arms an infant wrapped in purple fringe with gold. Accidentally he arose, thinking that Poppaea would pass the bench without turning attention to either. But she halted before them and said, Acte, the bells sent by thee for the doll were badly fastened. The child tore off one and put it on her mouth. Luckily Lilith saw it in season. Pardon, divinity, answered Acte, crossing her arms on her breast and bending her head. But Poppaea began to gaze at Lygia. What slave is this? Asked she, after a pause. She is not a slave, divine Augusta, but a foster child of Pomponia Graecina, and a daughter of the Lygian king given by him as a hostage to Rome. And has she come to visit thee? No, Augusta. She is dwelling in the palace since the day before yesterday. Was she at the feast last night? She was, Augusta. At whose command? At Caesar's command. Poppaea looked still more attentively at Lygia, who stood with bowed head, now raising her bright eyes to her with curiosity, now covering them with their lids. Suddenly a frown appeared between the brows of the Augusta, jealous of her own beauty and power. She lived in the continual alarm lest at some time a fortunate rival might ruin her, as she had ruined Octavia. Since every beautiful face in the palace roused her suspicion, with the eye of a critic she took it at once every part of Lygia's form, estimated every detail of her face, and was frightened. That is simply a nymph, thought she, and thought on Venus who gave birth to her. On a sudden this came to her mind which has never come before at sight of any beauty, that she herself had grown notably older. Wounded vanity quivered in Poppaea. Alarm seized her, and various fears shot through her head. Perhaps Nero has not seen the girl, or seeing her through the emerald, has not appreciated her. But what will happen should meet such a marvel in daytime in sunlight? Moreover, she is not a slave, she is a daughter of a king of barbarians, it is true, but a king, immortal gods. She is as beautiful as I am, but younger. The wrinkle between her brows increased, and her eyes began to shine under their golden lashes with a cold gleam. Hast thou spoken with Caesar? No, Augusta. Why dost thou choose to be here rather in the house of Aulus? I did not choose, lady. Petronius persuaded Caesar to take me from Pomponia, and I am here against my will. And whilst thou return to Pomponia? This last question Poppaea gave with a softer and milder voice. Hence, a sudden hope rose in Lygia's heart. Lady, said she, extending her hand to her, Caesar promised to give me as a slave to Vinicius. But though thou intercede and return me to Pomponia. Then Petronius persuaded Caesar to take thee from Aulus, and give thee to Vinicius? True, lady, Vinicius is to send for me today, but thou art good, have compassion on me. When she had said this, she inclined and seized the border of Pompeia's robe, waited for her word with a beating heart. Pompeia looked at her for a while, with a face lightened by a evil smile, and said, "Then I promise that thou wilt become the slave of Vinicius this day." And she went on, beautiful as a vision, but evil. To the ears of Lygia and Acte came only the wail of the infant, which began to cry. It was unknown for what reason. Lygia's eyes, too, were filled with tears. After a while she took Acte's hand and said, "Let us return. Help is to be looked for only whence it can come." And they returned to the atrium, which they did not leave till evening. When darkness had come and slaves brought in tapers with great flames, both women were very pale. Their conversation fell every moment. Both were listening to hear if someone were coming. Lygia repeated again and again that though grieved to leave Acte, she preferred that all should take place that day, as Ursus must be waiting in the dark for her then. But her breathing grew quicker from emotion and louder. Acte collected furiously such jewels as she could, and fastening them in a corner of Lygia's peplus, implored her not to reject that gift and means of escape. At moments came a deep silence full of deceptions for the ear. It seemed to both that they heard at one time a whisper beyond the curtain, at another the distant weeping of a child, at another the barking of dogs. Suddenly the curtain of the entrance moved without noise, and a tall dark man, his face marked with smallpox, appeared like a spirit in the atrium. In one moment Lygia recognized Atacinus, a freedman of Vinicius, who had visited the house of Aulus. Actus screamed, but Atacinus bent low and said, "A greeting, divine Lygia, from Marcus Vinicius, who awaits thee with a feast in his house, which is decked in green." The lips of the maiden grew pale. "I go," said she, and then she threw her arms around Acta's neck in farewell.